My husband's mother stood in the doorway of our home, her face twisted with rage, screaming at me to remove my grandmother's vintage mink coat because I didn't earn the right to wear it. I slowly unbuttoned it, let it slide from my shoulders, and watched her expression change from triumph to horror as she saw what I was holding underneath. The original deed to her house, the house she thought she owned, the house she'd been using as leverage to control her son for decades. Turns out my grandfather had owned it all along, and I'd just inherited everything. 3 days before this moment, I'd been sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled like old leather and lemon furniture polish, learning that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. My grandfather had died 2 months earlier at the age of 94, sharp as a tack until the very end, and his will had finally cleared probate. I'd expected maybe some savings bonds, perhaps a few pieces of furniture with sentimental value. What I got instead was an empire I hadn't known existed. Your grandfather was a very careful man, the attorney, Mr. Whitmore, had said, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. He was elderly himself, probably in his 70s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful diction of someone who'd spent his entire life translating complex legal matters into language normal people could understand. He made certain investments over the years, property primarily. He believed in tangible assets. I'd opened the folder with hands that shook slightly. Inside were property deeds, dozens of them, apartment buildings, commercial properties, 3 rental houses, and, my breath had caught in my throat, a single-family residence at 2847 Maple Drive. That was Diane's address, my mother-in-law's address. The house she'd lived in for 40 years, the house she lorded over like a queen in her castle, the house she constantly referenced when she wanted to remind me of her superiority. "I don't understand," I'd said slowly. "This is my mother-in-law's house. Why would my grandfather own the deed?" Mr. Whitmore had smiled, thin and knowing. "Your grandfather purchased this property in 1979 from the bank when it was in foreclosure. The previous owners, a Mr. and Mrs. Richard Morrison, had defaulted on their mortgage after Mr. Morrison's business failed. Your grandfather bought it at auction, then allowed the Morrisons to remain as tenants, paying below-market rent as a courtesy. When Richard Morrison died in 1995, your grandfather continued the same arrangement with the widow, Diane Morrison." Diane, my mother-in-law, who had spent the last 5 years of my marriage to her son treating me like I was dirt on her expensive shoes. "She's been renting?" I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "All this time she's been renting?" "At approximately 40% of market rate, yes. Your grandfather was a generous landlord. He never raised the rent, never enforced late payment penalties, never pursued eviction, despite the fact that Mrs. Morrison has been consistently late with payments for the past decade." Mr. Whitmore had folded his hands on the desk. "Your grandfather left instructions that you were to be informed of the full situation. He also left a letter for you." The letter had been in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, the script of a man whose hands no longer quite obeyed him, but whose mind remained diamond sharp. "My dearest Caroline, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've just learned that Diane Morrison has been my tenant for over 40 years. I'm sure this comes as quite a shock. Let me explain. When I bought that house in '79, I knew the Morrisons were in trouble. Richard had made some poor business decisions, gotten in over his head with the wrong people, and the bank was taking everything. Diane had 2 young sons, one of them being the boy you'd eventually marry, and nowhere to go. I couldn't in good conscience let a family with children end up on the street. So I bought the property and let them stay. I charged rent, but kept it low. Richard was a proud man, wouldn't accept charity. The rent arrangement let him keep his dignity. Over the years, I watched Diane transform that charity into a story she told herself. She began to believe she owned the house, told people she owned it, let everyone, including her sons, believe she was a woman of property and means. I never corrected her. It seemed harmless enough. But I also watched how she treated you after you married her son. The condescension, the cruelty, the way she wielded her imaginary superiority like a weapon. And I thought about your grandmother, God rest her soul, who came from nothing and was treated like nothing by people who thought they were better than her. It made my blood boil. So here's what I'm giving you, Caroline, the truth and the power that comes with it. That house is yours now. Every property in that folder is yours. You can do with them as you see fit. But let me tell you what I hope you'll do. I hope you'll stand up for yourself. I hope you'll show Diane Morrison that kindness shouldn't be mistaken for weakness, and that the person she's been looking down on for years is actually the one holding all the cards. Your grandmother would have loved you so much. I loved you enough for both of us. Use this gift wisely. All my love, Grandpa Jim. I'd cried in that lawyer's office, big, ugly tears that I couldn't control, while Mr. Whitmore tactfully busied himself with paperwork and pretended not to notice. My grandfather had known, had seen everything, and had given me the means to change it. The relationship with my mother-in-law had been toxic from the beginning. I'd met Marcus at a coffee shop 5 years ago, a meet-cute straight out of a romantic comedy where he'd accidentally taken my latte and I'd ended up with his black coffee. And we'd laughed about it and ended up talking for 3 hours. He was handsome, kind, worked as a civil engineer, loved hiking and old movies, and cooking elaborate meals on Sunday afternoons. 6 months later, he'd proposed. I'd said yes without hesitation. Then I'd met Diane. She'd examined me like I was a used car she was considering purchasing, her cold blue eyes cataloging every flaw. My clothes weren't right, too casual, too cheap. My job as a social worker didn't impress her. Not much money in that, is there? My family background was unsuitable. Your father was a mechanic? How blue-collar? Even my appearance was subject to constant criticism. Too short, too plain, hair too mousy. I always thought Marcus would marry someone more striking. The wedding had been a nightmare. Diane had inserted herself into every decision, overruled every choice I'd made, and somehow convinced Marcus that she was just trying to help. The flowers I'd wanted were replaced with her preferences. The venue I'd chosen was too small. What will people think? My modest guest list was overwhelmed by her extensive social circle. By the time I walked down an aisle I barely recognized, in a dress that was her third choice instead of my first, I felt like a guest at my own wedding. The marriage itself had been a constant battle for Marcus's attention and loyalty. Diane called every day, multiple times a day, inserted herself into our lives with demands disguised as requests. Sunday dinners at her house were mandatory. Holidays were spent at her home, following her traditions, eating food she'd prepared, playing out the role of dutiful daughter-in-law while she sat like a monarch holding court. And always, always, there was the house. Her beautiful house on Maple Drive, with its wraparound porch and mature landscaping and expensive furnishings. She referenced it constantly, wielded it like proof of her superiority. When you own property like I do, you understand certain things. Of course, living in a rental like you two do, you wouldn't know about property taxes. Maybe someday you'll be able to afford a real home like mine. Marcus and I did rent a 2-bedroom apartment that we couldn't really afford because Marcus sent his mother money every month. She's struggling, he'd say when I questioned it. The house is expensive to maintain. She's my mother, Caroline. I can't just let her lose everything. Money she claimed she needed for property taxes, for repairs, for utilities. Money that came out of our savings, our vacation fund, our future. And I'd bitten my tongue and said nothing because fighting about it just led to Marcus defending his mother and me feeling like the villain for resenting her. But now I knew the truth. She didn't pay property taxes. My grandfather had paid them, and now I would. The house wasn't expensive to maintain on her income because her income wasn't covering it. My grandfather's below-market rent and Marcus's guilt-motivated checks were. I'd spent 2 days after that meeting with Mr. Whitmore just sitting with the information, processing it, feeling the weight of it. The folder of property deeds sat on my kitchen table like a bomb waiting to detonate. Marcus had noticed my distraction. "You okay? You've been quiet since you came back from the lawyer's office." "Just processing," I'd said. "Grandpa left me some things. It's a lot to take in." "Was it much? I know you were worried about probate eating up everything." I'd looked at my husband, my kind, well-meaning, deeply enmeshed husband, and made a decision. "We'll talk about it soon, I promise." Because I'd realized something in those 2 days of sitting with my grandfather's letter and the evidence of his quiet generosity. This wasn't just about me and Diane. This was about Marcus, too. About whether he was capable of seeing his mother clearly. About whether our marriage could survive the truth. The confrontation had happened by accident, which somehow made it more perfect. Diane had shown up at our apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, letting herself in with the key Marcus had given her, despite my objections. I'd been getting ready to go to a memorial service for one of my grandfather's old friends, and I'd been wearing the coat. My grandmother's vintage mink, beautifully maintained, a relic from the 1960s when such things were glamorous rather than controversial. My grandfather had kept it in storage, preserved perfectly, and Mr. Whitmore had given it to me, along with a note. She wore this to the symphony. She'd want you to have it. I'd put it on that morning feeling close to grandparents I'd lost, wrapped in love and memory. Diane had taken one look at me, and her face had contorted with rage. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It was my grandmother's," I'd said calmly. "My grandfather kept it for me." "Take it off." She'd stepped closer, her finger jabbing toward me like a weapon. "Take it off right now. You didn't earn the right to wear something like that. Do you have any idea what real fur costs? What it represents? You can't just parade around in vintage mink like you're someone important when you're a social worker living in a rental apartment." Marcus had emerged from the bedroom, his hair wet from the shower. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I'm teaching your wife about appropriateness," Diane had snapped. "Look at her, wearing that coat like she's some kind of socialite. It's embarrassing. She's embarrassing you." Something in me had gone very still and very cold. I'd been patient for 5 years, swallowed criticism, endured insults, played the role of the inferior daughter-in-law because I loved Marcus and wanted peace. But standing there in my grandmother's coat, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind, "Stand up for yourself," I'd felt something shift. "You want me to take off the coat?" I'd asked quietly. "Yes, immediately. You look ridiculous." I'd smiled then, slow and deliberate, and I'd begun unbuttoning it, one button at a time, while Diane watched with triumphant satisfaction, and Marcus looked confused. "Caroline, you don't have to," he'd started. "No, it's fine," I'd interrupted. "She's right. I should take it off." The coat had slid from my shoulders, and I draped it carefully over the back of our couch. Underneath, I'd been wearing a simple black dress for the memorial service, and in my hands, carried inside the coat like a secret, was the folder with the property deeds. I'd opened it slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the deed to 2,847 Maple Drive. "Since we're talking about what people have earned," I'd said, my voice still quiet but with steel underneath, "let's talk about this house." I'd held up the deed so she could see it, watched her eyes focus on it, watched recognition dawn, watched her face go from flushed with anger to pale with shock. "That's my house," she'd said, but her voice had wavered. You can't have that. That's my deed." "No, Diane, this is my deed. To the house you've been renting from my grandfather for 40 years. The house you've been pretending to own. The house you've been using as proof of your superiority when in reality you've been a tenant paying below market rent out of charity." The silence in the apartment had been absolute. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to have stopped. Marcus had moved closer, taking the deed from my hands, reading it. I'd watched his face as he processed the information. Confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror as he started to understand. "Mom?" His voice had been small, young. "You told me you owned the house. You said you paid it off after Dad died." Diane's mouth had opened and closed. No sound came out. "All those payments I've been sending you," Marcus had continued, his voice growing stronger, harder, "for property taxes, for maintenance, for utilities. Where did that money actually go, Mom?" She'd started, then stopped. Her hands had begun to shake. "Your grandfather never told me he was giving the property to anyone. He promised I could stay. He promised—" "He did let you stay," I'd interrupted, "for 40 years. At a fraction of what you should have been paying. He could have evicted you at any time, especially in the last decade when you've been consistently late with rent. But he didn't, because unlike you, he believed in kindness." I'd pulled out more documents, rent receipts showing her payment history, late notices my grandfather had never acted on, market analysis showing what the house should have been renting for. The math was devastating. My grandfather had subsidized Diane's lifestyle to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Every time you criticized my job, my background, my clothes, my worthiness to be part of your family, I'd said, each word precisely placed. You were doing it from a house you didn't own, using money your son gave you based on lies, while accepting charity from my family that you never acknowledged. Caroline, Marcus had started. Let me finish. I turned to him. Your mother has been using her imaginary property ownership to manipulate you, to make you feel like you owe her, to keep you tied to her with guilt and obligation. Meanwhile, you've been sending her thousands of dollars that we couldn't afford, money that should have gone into our savings, our future, our life together. Because she let you believe she was struggling to maintain property she owned, when in reality, she was a subsidized tenant pretending to be a landlord. Marcus had looked at his mother. Is this true? All of it? Diane had crumpled then, sinking onto our couch like her strings had been cut. I never meant for it to get this far, she'd whispered. After your father died, I was so ashamed. We'd lost everything, the business, the savings, everything. And then this man, Caroline's grandfather, he bought our house but let us stay. And I was so grateful, but also so humiliated. So when people asked, I let them think I still owned it. And then it became easier to keep pretending than to tell the truth. You've been lying for 40 years, Marcus had said flatly. I was protecting you, protecting our family's reputation. If people knew we'd lost everything, that we were just tenants, you were protecting your ego, I'd corrected. And in the process, you made me feel small and worthless for 5 years. You criticized everything about me, used your supposed property ownership as proof that you were better than me, more deserving, more worthy. When the truth is, my family has been quietly supporting your lie for decades. I'd pulled out the final document. This is a notice to quit. That's the legal term for an eviction notice. You have 60 days to vacate the property at 2847 Maple Drive. Diane's head had snapped up. You can't evict me. You can't. I can. I'm the property owner. And frankly, after 5 years of your treatment, I have no interest in continuing my grandfather's charity. I'd paused, letting that sink in. However, my grandfather's letter suggested I show you the same kindness he did. So here's what's going to happen instead. I'd pulled out a rental agreement I'd had Mr. Whitmore draft. You're going to sign a proper lease. You're going to pay market rate rent, which is $3,000 per month. You're going to pay on time, in full, with no assistance from Marcus. You're going to maintain the property according to the terms of the lease. And you're going to stop using property you don't own as leverage to control your son. $3,000? Her voice had been faint. I can't afford that on my income. Then you'll need to find different housing, or get a job, or learn to live within your actual means instead of the fictional means you've been pretending to have. I'd sat down across from her. My grandfather kept your rent low out of kindness. I'm raising it to market rate out of necessity. Not revenge, necessity. This is what the property is worth. This is what tenants pay. Welcome to reality, Diane. Marcus had been reading through the documents, his face growing more and more set. The money I've been sending you, all this time, we could have bought our own house with that money. You're my son. You lied to me for years. Let me think you were struggling when you were just... He trailed off, looking lost. I gave you almost $60,000 in the past 5 years alone. $60,000 that Caroline and I could have used for a down payment, for our future, for the family we've been putting off because we couldn't afford it. The family we'd been putting off. That landed hard. We'd talked about kids, about wanting them, about the life we'd build. But always the refrain, we need to save more first. We need to be stable after we help Mom get on her feet. Mom, who'd been standing on our feet the entire time. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus had said, and his voice had changed. It was the voice he used at work, authoritative and final. You're going to sign Caroline's lease agreement. You're going to stop asking me for money. You're going to stop criticizing my wife. And you're going to start being the mother I thought you were, instead of the person I'm realizing you actually are. "Marcus, please, and if you can't do those things," he'd continued, "then Caroline will evict you, and you'll need to figure out your life without our help. Because I'm done, Mom. I'm done being manipulated. I'm done feeling guilty. I'm done choosing you over my marriage." Diane had signed the lease with shaking hands. She'd left our apartment without another word, clutching the rental agreement like it burned her. After she'd gone, Marcus had stood at our window, looking out at nothing. I'd given him space, time, whatever he needed. Finally, he'd turned to me. "I'm sorry." "I know." "No, I mean, God, Caroline, I'm so sorry. For all of it. For not seeing what she was doing. For letting her treat you like that. For prioritizing her imaginary crisis over our actual life." His voice had cracked. $60,000. We could have had a house. We can have all of that now, I'd said softly. That's what my grandfather gave us. Not just the properties, though there are enough of them that will be financially comfortable for life, but the truth, the leverage to finally break free of her control. He'd moved to me then, pulled me into his arms. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," I'd agreed, and felt him laugh against my hair, a sound that was half sob. "But you're going to spend the rest of our lives making it up to me." Deal. That evening, I'd gone through the rest of the property folder with Marcus. The apartment buildings that were generating steady rental income, the commercial properties with long-term leases, the rental houses that were well-maintained and profitable. Combined with my social work salary and Marcus's engineer income, we were looking at financial security we'd never dreamed of. "We should sell some of them," Marcus had said, "reduce the management burden, buy our own house outright." No. I'd surprised both of us with the certainty in my voice. My grandfather built this slowly, carefully, over decades. He believed in providing housing, in being a fair landlord, in the value of real property. I want to honor that. I want to learn how he managed it and continue his work. Mr. Whitmore had helped me set up a property management company, helped me learn the business from the ground up. I discovered I had a talent for it. The organizational skills from social work translated perfectly to managing multiple properties, and the empathy I developed in that field made me a landlord my tenants actually respected. Diane had lasted exactly 3 months before she'd called, asking if we could revisit the rent amount. I'd said no. She'd tried going to Marcus. He'd referred her back to me. She'd tried guilt, tears, reminders of family obligation. I'd reminded her of the eviction alternative. She'd started picking up shifts at a department store, got a roommate to help cover costs, began, for the first time in decades, living within her actual means instead of the fantasy she'd constructed. And something interesting had happened. Without the lie to maintain, without the need to constantly perform superiority, Diane had slowly become smaller, quieter, and oddly, more genuine. She'd never be my friend. The damage was too deep, too many years of cruelty to simply erase. But she'd stopped criticizing me, stopped calling Marcus every day, started, haltingly, trying to build a relationship based on reality instead of manipulation. It was Marcus who'd surprised me most. Freed from his mother's constant demands and guilt trips, he'd blossomed, became more confident, more present, more himself. We'd bought a house. Not a mansion, but a lovely 3-bedroom with good bones and a yard where we could plant a garden. We'd started seriously trying for a baby. 1 year after that confrontation in our apartment, I'd stood in the house on Maple Drive doing a routine property inspection. Diane had maintained it well, kept it clean, made the rent payments on time. She'd become a good tenant, if nothing else. "The furnace is working well," she'd said, following me through the basement. There'd been an awkwardness between us still, maybe always would be. "And I fixed that leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom like you asked." "Thank you," I'd said. Professional, polite, nothing more. As I'd headed for the door, she'd stopped me. "Caroline, wait." I'd turned. "I want to say," she'd struggled with the words, "your grandfather was a good man, better than I deserved. And you've been fairer to me than I had any right to expect after how I treated you." She'd looked at the floor. "I was jealous, I think, of what you had with Marcus, of your education, your purpose, your certainty about who you were. I'd built my entire identity on owning this house, and when that turned out to be a lie, I had nothing left but meanness. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was something. My grandfather believed everyone deserved a chance," I'd said. Not infinite chances, but one good one. He gave you that, and now I'm giving you another. Don't waste it." She'd nodded, eyes bright with tears she didn't let fall. I'd driven home that evening to the house Marcus and I owned together, truly owned, no landlord or mortgage hanging over us. He'd been in the kitchen making dinner, and the smell of garlic and tomatoes had filled the air. Normal, domestic, beautiful. "How'd the inspection go?" he'd asked as I'd walked in. "Fine, everything's fine." I'd wrapped my arms around him from behind, rested my cheek against his back. "Your mom's keeping up with maintenance." "That's good." He'd turned in my embrace, kissed my forehead. "I love you. I don't say that enough." "You say it plenty." "Not enough to make up for 5 years of letting my mother treat you like you weren't worthy of me, when the truth was, I was never worthy of you." I'd smiled against his shirt. "Lucky for you, my grandfather left me enough assets that I can afford to keep you around anyway." He'd laughed, real and warm, and we'd stood there in our kitchen, in our home, building the life we should have had all along. The vintage mink coat hangs in my closet now. I wear it on special occasions, always remembering the look on Diane's face when I'd removed it and revealed the deed underneath. Not with cruelty, I'm not her, will never be her, but with satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing that kindness isn't weakness, that patience isn't the same as being a doormat, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply reveal the truth. My grandfather's letter is framed on my office wall. I read it sometimes when I'm dealing with difficult tenants or complex property issues, and I remember what he taught me, that wealth isn't just about money. It's about knowing your worth, using your power wisely, standing up for yourself when necessary, and that a coat is just a coat, but the truth is priceless.